So the Supreme Court just decided to grant emergency review to the TikTok ban case based on the First Amendment. And currently, TikTok is asking for the Supreme Court to reverse this act, which is set to ban TikTok nationwide on January 19th. So let's break down what is happening in this case. Now, really quick before we jump into this video, I just want to ask that if you guys like this channel and you want to support this type of content, please consider liking the video and subscribing. Also, feel free to share this video to other platforms, even if you want to chop it up and put it on TikTok, feel free to do that. But just always, make sure you're giving me credit. And I want this to get out to more people because I know this is a topic and an issue that a lot of people are concerned about, especially a lot of people over on other platforms. So feel free to share it around, support the channel. That's a great way to do that. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we're going to be talking about the controversial TikTok ban case and the current emergency review that was just granted by the United States Supreme Court. Now, you may be asking yourself, why am I covering this here on my channel? Well, this law and this challenge will impact a lot of people. It's going to impact a lot of firearms content creators. It's going to impact a lot of gun-related content that's also over there on that platform. Now, me personally, I'm not a huge fan of TikTok because they highly censored this type of content over on their platform. In my opinion, they're not friends of the First Amendment. They censored this type of content a lot. They're not friends of the Second Amendment. But this is an issue that's going to impact a lot of people. And this is moving forward as a First Amendment constitutional challenge, which also could impact other platforms. TikTok is claiming that this law passed by Congress, which bans TikTok come January 19th, is a violation of the First Amendment. Multiple cases were just consolidated by the Supreme Court and now will move forward under the name TikTok Inc. versus Garland. This case at its core is a challenge to the Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversary Controlled Applications Act, which effectively found that TikTok is a national security threat and needed to be banned within the United States. As this issue currently stands, without Supreme Court emergency intervention, the app would be banned nationwide within the United States come January 19th. So we need to do some procedural background on this case so you understand how the lower court ruled in this case, what they said, and where this currently stands as far as litigation and what the Supreme Court does from here. Now, this case and many other cases were filed in the DC Court of Appeals and consolidated for review in that DC Court of Appeals. The DC Court of Appeals held the act is one of the rare laws that can survive strict scrutiny, and it did this based on Congress's concerns about potential risks that this app actually creates through its association with the nation of China. The DC Court of Appeals agreed with TikTok and found that this act did implicate the First Amendment, and based on that, they subjected review to this case to heightened scrutiny. Now, for those not aware, if you don't follow constitutional law issues and you haven't been following this channel for a while, when it comes to this heightened scrutiny, when it comes to First Amendment constitutional review, they looked at tiered-based scrutiny, and tiered-based scrutiny is kind of exactly what it sounds like. There are different levels of review. At the very bottom, and the easiest type of review to pass would be rational basis, and then at the middle would be intermediate scrutiny, and then at the very top would be strict scrutiny. And again, strict scrutiny is the hardest analysis to pass. Now, on this issue, the Court of Appeals stated that we think it's clear that some level of heightened scrutiny is required. The question whether intermediate or strict scrutiny applies is difficult because the TikTok-specific provisions are facially content neutral, yet the government justifies the act in substantial part by reference to a foreign adversary's ability to manipulate content seen by Americans. No Supreme Court case directly addresses whether such a justification renders a law content-based, thereby triggering strict scrutiny. There are reasonable bases to conclude that intermediate scrutiny is appropriate even under these circumstances. We need not, however, definitively decide that question because we conclude the act passes muster even under the more demanding standard. So here, the District Court of Appeals said, we're not going to look at intermediate scrutiny. We're not going to look at rational basis or any of that because we believe that this act still passes strict scrutiny. So the hardest type of analysis, it still passes that. So TikTok wanted strict scrutiny. When it came to the government, they wanted either intermediate or rational basis. But what ended up happening is this law, still was found valid even under the hardest standard. So the government won even using the hardest standard. Now, when it comes to satisfying strict scrutiny, the government must demonstrate that the speech restriction one, serves a compelling government interest, and two, is narrowly tailored to further that interest. The Court of Appeals found that that act here serves the compelling interest of national security, which is supported by facts and evidence about the threat that TikTok serves. So there was a lot of congressional data that was gathered and a lot of investigations into the app itself. There was bipartisan support, concern about this app. And so the court here found that that compelling government interest of national security is met with this act. They also found that this act here is narrowly tailored because this law only targets social media companies that are controlled by foreign adversaries. So it's limited in nature to just those types of instances. But even with this law, there are exemptions. And so there are ways that are narrowly written into this law that a company like TikTok can get around it. And that is by divestiture. And since this act passed strict scrutiny, they denied TikTok's request for a permanent injunction against this TikTok ban. In the case, TikTok also asked for a preliminary injunction, which is a more temporary form of relief, but the court here denied that request since they actually ruled on the merits. Now, in response to that decision, TikTok decided to go to the Supreme Court for emergency Supreme Court review. They filed an emergency application. That emergency application asked for an injunction pending review by the Supreme Court. In essence, TikTok wanted the Supreme Court to place an emergency injunction right here and now on the TikTok ban. And they wanted that to immediately happen on this act because they wanted to prevent it from going into effect on January 19th. And that would also remain in place until the Supreme Court would take action on this case, hear oral arguments on this, and then decide on the full merits of the case. Well, today we just received an order from the Supreme Court on that emergency application, and the Supreme Court decided to grant a petition for a full review of this case. The order of the Supreme Court states that for the injunction pending review presented to Chief Justice Roberts and by him referred to the court is deferred pending oral argument. Applicants suggested this court treat the application as a petition for a writ of cert. Doing so, the petition is granted. The petition for the writ of cert in one of the cases is granted. The cases are consolidated and a total of 2 hours is allocated for oral argument. The parties are directed to brief and argue the following question: whether the Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversary Controlled Applications Act as applied to petitioners violates the First Amendment. The parties are directed to file electronically simultaneously opening briefs by December 27th, reply briefs on Friday, January 3rd, 2025, and amicus briefs are due December 27th, 2024. The case is set for oral argument on Friday, January 10th, 2025. So what does that order mean for this lawsuit, and what does it mean for the TikTok ban that is currently pending and could take effect on January 19th? First and most importantly, the Supreme Court has treated the emergency application as an actual petition for Supreme Court review, and they granted a review on the merits of this case, and oral arguments are set for January 10th. So they're going to hear actual merits-based arguments on January 10th. That hearing will be a 2-hour argument on the consolidated cases. And in the order, the Supreme Court has decided to defer any emergency injunction on the act until after the oral arguments. That means that after the January 10th oral arguments, they could decide to issue a temporary injunction on the TikTok ban. And in doing so, that would allow TikTok to still operate within the United States while the Supreme Court is going to write the merits-based decision. And so there is still a possibility that they could issue a temporary emergency injunction after the oral argument. So they said that they're not going to take that off the table. They're just going to hear oral arguments first. And then if they decide after the fact they want to issue a temporary injunction, they can do that. Or they could just issue a decision on the merits of the case. Now, what will the Supreme Court be hearing and considering on that January 10th date? The question the Supreme Court will be reviewing is whether the Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversary Controlled Applications Act as applied to TikTok, the petitioners, actually violates the First Amendment. So this will be a pure constitutional decision based on the First Amendment. And at stake is whether or not TikTok will no longer be able to operate within the US in its current corporate structure. Keep in mind the Supreme Court will also be reviewing whether or not the DC Court of Appeals got the strict scrutiny analysis correct. The Supreme Court, to reverse that decision, would have to find that the act does not serve a compelling government interest or a compelling government purpose, and that it is not narrowly tailored to meet that purpose. So quickly, over the following weeks, we're going to see a ton of argument briefs being filed, the opening briefs, the reply briefs, the response briefs, amicus briefs from outside third parties will also be filed to this. And then on January 10th, the oral arguments will take place in this case. Then I suspect we will see either a quick decision by the Supreme Court before January 19th, or we will see some sort of order on the granting of a temporary injunction or a denial of the temporary injunction. So really interesting case and challenge that is really going to impact millions of people within the US who use the app. So if you guys found this video helpful, make sure you share it around. Also, as we get more information, I will let you guys know. But as always, thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, but never forget this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.